So much energy in the room. So much energy in the room. So we're just going to shift things up a bit. And if you could all help me welcome to the stage Laszlo Bock. Thanks so much for joining us. Good
Pleasure
to
to
see you
be here.
again. Yep.
Thanks for feeding me.
Of course. So you were at Google for 10 years until last summer. When you first started Google, how many employees?
When I interviewed, it was 3,000. By the time they hired me, it was 6,000.
Okay. And when you left, it was how many?
A little over 72,000. Yeah.
And so you were head of people operations, as it was called. And how big was your staff?
It's funny. When I worked at Google, the answer would be it's confidential. We don't actually, Google doesn't share that number.
Awesome.
I think they'd probably be pretty ticked if I told you, though. It was a lot. It was a lot.
Was it less than 1,000?
I will say it was a number. This is going to be a long interview.
Yeah, all right. But when you and I talked before, you had a very interesting makeup. You had a lot of statisticians, management consultants. So tell me at least a bit the makeup of your staff.
Yeah, so the model was I segmented the group into thirds in terms of hiring. So 1/3 came from traditional HR backgrounds because you need somebody who knows what they're doing. 1/3 were former management consultants, and I really tried to focus on the top tier firms because what they brought was change management, problem structuring, client skills, which was useful, and I figured they could learn the HR stuff. And the last third were people with master's and PhD degrees in analytic fields. So statistics, physics, organizational psychology, and what they did was they actually gave us the science to prove all this stuff we were making up actually worked or didn't work.
Right. And the cool thing is having such a huge staff, when you were flossing your teeth in the morning, you had some interesting question that popped into your head, you could get 1,000 people to answer it for you.
There were far fewer people than that when I was flossing my teeth in my bathroom. But it was interesting because sort of the rap on Google is, oh, Google's rich, you have all this money, you can't do this stuff. In my function, we always grew more slowly than the rest of the company. And I had set with my team productivity and efficiency goals every year. So the way I actually funded this was when we started, people analytics, for example, applying all the science. There were 3 people who had quant backgrounds on different teams, and I said, okay, you're now the people analytics team. And they said, no, I don't want to do that. But we put them together, and then I funded that by actually not building a leadership development team for 2 years. And what that gave me was the headcount I would have spent on this other thing I could invest in what I hoped would be the right thing.
Okay. So 10 years at Google, here's a step back question. When you think about what you knew and came to learn over your 10 years there, what were the biggest surprises for you? The things that when you started out, before you started asking these good, dumb questions and using all the data from Google to answer them. So what were the biggest insights, the surprises for you about culture?
Well, there were a few. One was I kind of came in, I had a few years HR experience from GE before that, but that was kind of it. And I came in thinking about succession planning and retaining people, and in my first meeting after joining with Eric Schmidt, I said, here's what we need to do. He said, you're completely wrong. That's all the wrong stuff. We need to focus on, once you've got a great team, keeping them together forever, not succession planning and things like that. And GE was sort of famous for discipline around that. So number one, I started from the wrong perspective. Number two, when I joined, there was this tremendous focus on pedigree. GPAs, test scores, where you went to school. We had something called the higher education database that the team had built. And there were thousands of schools in there and details on which major was good and which wasn't. And people would get rejected because they had a low GPA 20 years ago, right? When we hired Vint Cerf, one of the co-inventors of the internet, and he was in his 60s, I think, when he was hired, he was required to produce his college transcript, right? That's how out of control it was. And so we dug into this to see, does academic performance actually predict how you're going to perform in a job? And it turns out there's a small correlation your first couple years out of school, then there's no relationship whatsoever. So one of the big findings was you have to look beyond that, and you can't just rely on where someone went to school or what their scores were. There were a bunch of others in the inclusion space around how the company's perceived outside and inside the company. Basically, I learned I was wrong about something big every month. for 10 years. It was pretty brutal.
And you're doing some advisory work now, and you've had so much experience at Google understanding what makes cultures work. So if you were to go into a company now and they were to ask you to do sort of a culture audit, like just come in, get a sense of what we're doing well, what we're not doing well, what's your checklist? What would you be looking for?
So there's two different approaches I would take. If it's just kind of show up and wander around and talk to people, there's one, but there's a kind of better, as you'd expect, analytic way to sort of get at this stuff. If I was just walking around, some of the small signals I'd look for are, this will sound silly, but are people having fun? Are they smiling or are they heads down? How much power distance is there? So, when you meet the CEO or founder or executives, are other people in the room kind of nervous and holding back, or do they treat them just like somebody else? Do they joke? Do they, we're sitting at dinner tonight and with a couple folks, and there's a CEO founder and there's his HR person, and joking back and forth, having a good time. That's a great sign. So are people free to express themselves? Do they feel a sense of voice in the company? I'd ask about, do people feel connected to something meaningful, a mission that is above and beyond making a buck? Because in organizations where that happens, people are more productive, they're happier. So I'd focus on those as a starting point.
And we've been talking about job interview questions, and I know that's something that you have opinions on. So let me just start by asking, what is your favorite job interview question? If interviewing were like speed dating, and you only had 5 minutes to interview somebody, what would you ask them?
It's going to be super boring, because it turns out with interviewing, we all think we're great at it, and we all sort of go through life, we interview people, we decide to hire someone, we're like, oh, this person's amazing, this person's the best. And then 5 years later, we're sitting around going, who hired these idiots? and we hired them. And so there's some science behind why this happens, but the best question, statistically, and from a scientific perspective, and the one I use most is, I ask people, give me an example of the hardest or one of the hardest problems you've solved. And then I ask them to walk through why they did certain things, how they did it, what happened, what their role was in solving the problem. And then if I had another 5 minutes, I'd say, give me another one. Because general cognitive ability and problem solving is most predictive of success in a job. The R-squared is something like 0.27. And getting under that with every candidate in the same way is the best way to predict whether they're actually going to perform or not.
Right. And that question is also interesting because it sends a signal of what they consider a hard problem.
Exactly right.
Because if their hard problem that they solved was deciding what kind of bagel to order, that sort of gives you an idea.
It's very true. Like there's a lot of meta information embedded in it, right? What they consider a hard problem, how many different approaches they took. And when you ask, one of the important things is when you're interviewing to ask the same question again and again and again of lots of people, because then you develop a sense of here's a good answer, here's a bad answer. There's more sophisticated ways to struggle or to structure it, but the meta information is incredibly valuable.
For years, Google was famous for those brain teaser questions, the how many golf balls can you fit in a 747 and things like that. So where did those start and how long did you do them? And
so I don't know.
And are you to blame? Or?
I'm not to blame. And actually, Google, how should I say this since I'm not there? While I was there, people weren't supposed to be asking those questions anymore. And I know some interviewers still did, so if you got any of those, I apologize. You shouldn't have, they screwed up. What I can say is by the time you got to the end of the interview process, so the final stage is all the offers get reviewed by some of the executives before going to Larry Page. And what I can say is any of those final offers that came to me with these kind of awful interview questions, we just ignored the feedback. Like, so if you blew it on your case, it didn't matter. I don't know the origin. Consultants and iBanks have used those for a long time. I think Google adopted it because they hired a bunch of former consultants and investment bankers. The problem with those questions is, again, they're not predictive. Number one, they don't predict. Number two, you can practice and get better. So if you go to any business school or law school campus, you'll find all these students just doing drills on these kinds of questions. And anything you can get better at, you can get coached at, is not going to be as purely predictive as something that isn't. So they serve mainly to make the interviewer feel clever,
right?
That they've outsmarted you, the poor candidate.
What was the theory in the first place with those things? Is it some insight into how your brain works? Or?
Yeah, the idea is you can see how people put ideas together and if they can come up with frameworks and how they solve problems. But the reality is it's an incredibly coachable skill. It's like doing math in your head. Like if you just practice a lot, you can get a lot better at it. Same thing with this. And what that means is it's really not useful for separating qualified from unqualified candidates.
And so what is the right answer? How many golf balls can you fit on a stick?
All of them. All of them. I don't know. No one ever asked me before today.
No, but isn't there, like when they ask people that question, isn't
Oh,
there, like get in the ballpark
yeah.
at least?
Yeah, no, there's a whole like dumb methodology thing where you estimate the volume of the swimming pool or the airplane or wherever you're going to store your golf balls. And you then simplify it to say, oh, it's a rectangle, and then you simplify the golf ball to be a little cube, and then you figure it. But it's just a process, and it's annoying and not predictive. And no one should ever ask those questions or have to suffer through them, including me right now.
Right. Was there a moment for you when you just said, enough of this, we're going to stop asking these questions?
Not a discrete moment, because one of the beautiful things for me about having been able to be at Google was it was such a scientific, evidence-driven, fact-based culture that even though I sort of had this intuitive response to it, I couldn't just go around and say, nah, I think it's a bad idea. So we had to study it, prove it, run controlled experiments where some candidates would get questions, some wouldn't. Then you measure what happens afterwards and if they're predictive. And so there wasn't a discrete moment. There was actual research and testing on human beings, human experimentation. And then we sort of got there over time, mostly because there's still pockets where people use them.
Could you share with the audience the story of Project Oxygen, which I did a story about years ago, but it was such great insight, such a great story. So if you take a couple of minutes and tell the group.
Yeah, so Project Oxygen was the internal code name for a project that this woman named Michelle Donovan, along with a guy named Neil Patel, took on. Neil's no longer with Google, Michelle is. And they basically said, engineers have been saying forever that managers are a bad thing. My manager slows me down. They don't add any value. Just leave me alone. Let me do my engineering. So they set out to prove that that was true. So we looked across the whole company and did an assessment of what teams and individuals are highest performing, which ones are viewed as most effective by the manager based on objective outputs, do people like working for certain people? A whole bunch of math happened. And what we found was, in fact, management does matter. And we found that there's a set of really, really good managers whose teams perform better and whose teams are happier and they are better retained. And there's the opposite that exists as well. So we got to that point where we're like, this is really interesting, but if you want it to actually be scientifically rigorous, you can't just take it in this situation, because this person could have just ended up with all the good people. You need an experiment where you take really happy people from these teams and give them to the worst managers in the company and see if they get less happy and if it gets worse. And you take really awful people who aren't performing well that you're about to fire and dump them on the best managers. And we thought it would be unethical to do that. But it turns out people moved around the company all the time, and they didn't know who the good and bad managers were. They were just rotating around trying new jobs. So we had a natural experiment. And what we found was if a terribly performing person switches to one of these high-performing managers, their performance gets meaningfully better and vice versa. So then we distilled it down to 8 things managers do, and none of it's rocket science. They have regular one-on-ones. They act as a coach. 3 things they shouldn't do. And then this actually goes back to your question about what was kind of surprising. I thought we should make this stuff mandatory, put the whole company through training, and Karen May, who leads people development at the company, was on my team, and she said, don't make it mandatory. She said, if you make it mandatory, people will tune out, it won't be effective. So we instead started surveying every 6 months, anonymously, what do you think of your manager on these attributes? And after 5 or 6 quarters, the average favorability score on a scale of 0 to 100 went from something like 57% favorable in the company to something like 78 or 80% favorable. Right? So over 2.5 years, we went from okay management to really a lot of good managers. And so the lessons were, number 1, management matters. Number 2, the things that make managers effective and teams happy are not rocket science. They're just kind of a pain to do, because no one likes doing one-on-ones. They're boring. It's hard as a manager. And number 3, if you just give people the feedback on how they're doing without connecting it to your bonus or promotion or what have you, and you tell people, Laszlo, you're in the 50th percentile or 40th percentile, most people want to get better, and they will. And they got better, and they keep getting better. And then we, there was can't remember the journalist, but a brilliant New York Times journalist wrote an amazing article about this years ago. And so the detail is public if you go on your search engine of choice and look up Project Oxygen. But it was really an amazing thing.
Yeah, that's great.
I think the journalist was really handsome too. I can't remember who he was.
What about, you've stumped me. What
You
about,
can't remember either.
exactly. What about your own evolution as a manager and leader? I mean, you've been studying how teams work, how managers work, what makes an effective manager. How have you evolved as a manager? What have been some key insights for you along the way?
I think, so the Google job was the biggest I'd ever had. Like, it was orders of magnitude bigger than the job I had before it. My team, when I was at GE, including dotted line direct reports, was something like 30 people. And day one at Google, it was massively bigger than that. And all the stuff that had made me successful up until that point were totally the wrong things going forward. So, for example, one was, I got to sort of middle management at GE because, and at my prior companies, because I was in the details, I was on top of it, and it was just too big. And I tried to do that, and I was, my first year and a half, I worked 6.5 days a week, 18-hour days. I have all these emails. When I was leaving, I went back through my old emails. I have all these emails that I'd sent to my dad at like 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning, going, Dad, I'm just leaving work. I'm so sorry I didn't call you today. So one was learning to let go and trust the team around me. And the beautiful thing I realized is when you give people around you more, they actually love it. And then lesson 2 was I could not just give them more, but I could give them the stuff I didn't want to do, like stuff I didn't like. And they were like, oh, this is great, I get to step up. I was like, I didn't want to do that anyway. And I felt guilty about that for a while. And then I think the biggest lesson was that there's something you can learn from every single person you interact with. And if you go into every meeting, every interaction, every interview trying to go, what can I get out of this person, whether they're strong performing or not, whether they're similar background, and in particular if they have a different background, you just learn every single day, and it's the best thing in the world.
That's great. We're going to open up to questions. I've got one more, and then we'll go to the audience. Is it just me? I find if I go on LinkedIn now or I see somebody's resume, I find the act of reading it is physically exhausting. It's just like resumes are getting longer and everybody's done, Save the Planet and World Peace and you've looked at thousands of resumes. Are they useful? What do you look for?
They're not that useful. One of the things the internet doesn't get enough credit for is getting rid of the bottom of the page, right? So it used to be a page, maybe 2, now it's, resumes. So from a scientific perspective, resumes aren't predictive either. People who are reviewing resumes tend to fixate on brands and pedigree instead of things that are really more meaningful. And people don't know how to write resumes really well. Most resumes are sort of a list of activities rather than actual accomplishments. So resumes are not a great way to kind of find people. What I would say is, though, obviously everyone's going to look at brands and pedigree, but look for things when you look at resumes that are a little different. So some of the things I look for are, I look for people who worked in college. And the reason is, if you worked in college, it's probably because you had to work and not because it was a choice. I look for people who, and this is something we saw in the data, who early in their career were promoted faster than every 2 years. Because early in your career, a 2-year promotion cycle is not that unusual, but if somebody's getting promoted every 18 months, that's pretty impressive. So there's a few signals, but resumes generally are a better way to screen people out than in, which means the main thing is, as you review resumes, you want to look for all these bias-driven flags, like, the research is, if you have an African-American, if you have a black-sounding name, you have to send out 50% more resumes than if you have a white-sounding name. So you want to sort of be cognizant of that and look for some of these other signals, and then it can be a little more helpful than it is.
I always find it interesting, those early jobs. I've sort of keep a running contest in my head of just interviewing so many CEOs of what is the worst job that somebody had when they were younger. And I did interview one CEO who worked on, it was sort of an assembly line for Preparation H. And it was his job with the scraper to get the suppositories that sort of fell off the, yeah. So right now he's winning, but, and I did meet somebody who said that that is their favorite job interview question, which is, what is the worst job you've ever had? Because with that comes some humility, right?
Yeah.
You've, whatever you've done, dug ditches or whatever, it's honest work.
That's probably a good one.
Yeah.
Did not think you were going there with that question, though.
No, I know.
Pretty uncomfortable.
All right, let's open up to the audience. There's a hand right there. Please say who you are. And, sorry. There's a microphone there, too.
James, I probably don't need one, do I? Is it true that Mike Judge broke into your office, stole your files, and wrote the script to the HBO series Silicon Valley?
Maybe.
He's tough, I gotta say.
What was it like filming with Vaughn and Owen Wilson?
Okay, so the question was, what was it like filming with Vaughn and Owen Wilson for the internship movie? So I wasn't involved. The Google marketing team was a little bit involved. They were doing the movie and then they reached out. So I can't really speak to the filming. They did only a couple days of filming on the Google campus, so the outdoor shots are the Google campus, a couple of them. But I will say, I did get to meet Vince Vaughn after when the movie came out. He's a lovely individual, really charming guy. So I don't know what it was like making the movie, but he's a nice guy.
Other questions? Right there. Please say your
Yes,
name.
hi Laszlo, this is Jen Dulski, change.org, also former Googler. That movie was filmed right outside my office when I was there. It was
Do you have an answer for his
amusing.
question, what it was like?
Amusing the whole
Okay.
time. They were quite funny. My question is about the hiring committee. So Google does this somewhat unusual thing where, as you mentioned, people interview and then the hiring manager doesn't make the decision, but rather a committee makes the final decision. It would be great to hear why they do that, if it's successful, if it works, et cetera.
Yeah, one of the most important things you can do, there's a few things if you want your hiring quality to get better. And I urge you to, if you're going to focus on people stuff, focus on hiring, because if you get that right, you kind of don't need to worry about the rest. And one of them is to have a hiring committee. So the hiring manager should not make the hiring decision for two reasons. One, hiring manager has all this pressure on him or herself that biases them, right? So imagine you're hiring an administrative assistant. Day one, you want somebody who's amazing. 6 months in, you want somebody who can just answer the phone and schedule a meeting and just make the herding stop, right? And then you also get pressure from, clients and your boss and all these things. So you're going to make decisions that are biased and under pressure. Reason one, not to have the manager. The reason to have a hiring committee, a separate group doing this, is because you want a group that's charged purely with maintaining quality. Like if I'm hiring for a small team, I just want bodies, I want people in there, I want us to like everybody. I'm willing to compromise on some things. As long as everybody likes this person, they're going to get along. But if I have a separate group that has to sign off on it and says, Laszlo's a wonderful guy, but he's not smart enough, or whatever the issue is, his hairline's terrible, and we draw a quality bar, that means everybody in your company is going to have to clear that quality bar, and you will, on average, end up with a stronger company. So that objectivity is everything.
Who else? I see a hand there. Yeah, we'll get the mics in a sec.
Hi, Krista Quarles, Open Table. Question about unconscious bias and gender equity, I guess, in work. And Google still doesn't have, when they've published their mix of female engineers, for example, why has that problem been so hard to crack? Is it just pipeline? And what progress do you feel like you made during your tenure?
I apologize, probably feel like a dodge. I don't want to. Someone at Google can speak to the current state of affairs a little better than me and should. But I think what's happened, first of all, part of the reason the numbers are hard to move is because you're constrained by hiring. So if you have a 10,000 person company and you're hiring a couple hundred people a year, it's going to take you decades to move that number, right? Another thing is there's, again, not speaking about Google, but if I take the tech industry as a whole, there's a lot of bias built into the system, and the industry is not as hospitable towards women as it could be even today. I think, though, to the industry's credit, and again, I'm not going into Google in particular on this, there was kind of a decision made 4 or 5 years ago to say there is a problem and we want to work on it. If you look across different industries, you haven't seen that same kind of commentary. And as somebody who's now outside the industry and not working for any tech company, I think a little credit is due for people saying like, hey, we got a problem, we got to work on it, even though it's not coming as fast as any of us would like. I think it'd be amazing if other industries also said, here's our data, we've got problems. I think the biggest things that will move the numbers are, number one, making the culture more hospitable to women, and not just women, to black people, to Hispanic people, to LGBT people of every kind of background, right? Making it a more inclusive culture. Google did release their unconscious bias program publicly. Facebook did the same thing. It's quite good. It's worth checking out. That had a big impact internally at these companies, at least. The second thing is all these companies should keep investing at the K through 12 and college level and feed the pipeline. But those two things together go a long way, because part of the issue is attracting people who are currently working today but don't want to be in the Bay Area, don't want to be in New York, don't want to be in the industry. And the second is about feeding the future. The third thing is companies need to look rigorously at their promotion rates, their hire rates, wage equity. Google shared publicly that there's no wage gap between men and women. And it happens because when a woman gets hired at Google, she gets on average a 30% higher increase than a man does. And the reason is women on average make about 30% less than men. But when you get hired at Google, women get the bigger increase, goes away, and that difference stays gone throughout careers. So if we really wanted to, we as a society, we could eliminate the gender wage gap in a decade, just because people switch jobs, and if you paid for the job not based on prior pay. So there's a lot of work to be done in terms of the culture, in terms of the pipeline, in terms of attracting people to the field, in terms of making it hospitable, and in terms of getting rid of all the inequities that exist. I think there's going to be a lot of work to be done for a long time, unfortunately, but at least it's being talked about, which is, I think, a little distinctive in that industry versus other industries.
Great. On a lighter note, what is your mundane superpower?
My mundane superpower. My mundane superpower is I have an uncanny ability to find disgusting things in my food. I'm serious. I first realized I had this ability when I was flying Delta years ago, and I was eating a salad, and there was the back half of a yellow jacket in my salad. And I went on to find a cockroach in my Thai iced tea in New York City, rubber glove in a plate of pasta, just the fingertip, so not the whole thing, that'd be gross. A friend of mine got married. We did a bachelor party, went out to a steakhouse. On my burger, I kid you not, I opened the burger, there was a plastic spider. A plastic spider, like a Halloween spider, and I asked the waitress, I'm like, what's going on? And they're like, oh, the cook's just having some fun. I was like, with who? But I will say, dinner was clean tonight.
Good.
So you all have nothing to worry about.
Yeah. I'm feeling some regret that I asked you that question. Anyways, please join me. Thank you to Laszlo Bock.
Thank you.